Conductor told Dean Martin, "This hall is for real musicians." Then Dean picked up a microphone. What happened next, at Carnegie Hall, in 1971, left 3,000 people speechless, and proved that sometimes the greatest performances come not from perfect technique, but from a heart that's lived enough to understand what music really means. March 18, 1971. Carnegie Hall, New York City. The Stern Auditorium glowed that evening, its cream and gold walls catching the light of 3,000 crystal bulbs as Manhattan's classical music elite gathered for the International Arts Foundation's annual charity gala. Ticket prices started at $1,500. The guest list read like a registry of old money, inherited culture, and the kind of sophistication that never needed to announce itself. Conductors, soloists, patrons, and the type of wealth that spoke in whispers about wine vintages and summer homes in the Hamptons filled the reception hall. But nobody in that auditorium knew that in exactly 27 minutes, a man from Steubenville, Ohio, a man most of them considered nothing more than a nightclub entertainer, would deliver a performance that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When Dean Martin walked through the oak-paneled doors, the first thing he noticed wasn't the grandeur. It was the way people looked at him and then looked away. He was 53 years old, tall and lean in his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His hair still dark with just touches of distinguished silver. His face carrying the easy confidence that had made him one of America's most beloved entertainers. Jen was beside him, wearing an elegant black evening gown and the kind of natural grace that didn't need diamonds to prove anything. They were there because Frank Sinatra had asked them to attend, supporting a cause that funded music education in underprivileged schools. Dean had almost declined. He was exhausted from a month of Vegas performances and just wanted to spend a quiet evening at home. But Jan had convinced him. "Dean," she'd said that afternoon, adjusting his black tie with steady hands, "we're not going because they invited us. We're going because music doesn't belong to people who think they own it." At the center of the reception hall, Maestro Heinrich Zimmermann held court with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 45 years being told he was extraordinary. Zimmermann was 68, Austrian-born, silver-haired with a conductor's posture that made him appear taller than his actual 5'8" frame. He had led the Vienna Philharmonic for 15 years, guest conducted at La Scala, at Covent Garden, at every major hall in Europe. His voice carried the authority of the old world. His opinions were even sharper, and his contempt for anything outside the classical canon was legendary among New York's cultural establishment. He'd once dismissed American popular music as commercialized sentiment dressed up with strings in a Times interview, and the quote had only deepened his admirers' devotion. Zimmermann was midway through an anecdote about conducting Mahler in Salzburg when his gaze landed on Dean. The conductor paused, crystal champagne flute suspended between chest and lips. Something shifted in his expression, a mixture of amusement and the particular satisfaction of a man who had just spotted an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. Dean and Jean had nearly reached the bar when Zimmermann's voice cut across the room with the precision of a baton striking a music stand. "Well," he said, projecting effortlessly in the way that only trained classical musicians could, "it appears Carnegie Hall has broadened its definition of artist this evening." Several people laughed, that polite society laugh that acknowledges wit while maintaining plausible deniability. Dean's expression didn't change. He'd been hearing variations of this his entire career. Zimmermann separated from his circle and approached them, champagne in one hand, the other clasped behind his back in the classical conductor's pose. "Mr. Martin, isn't it?" he said, his accent lending old-world sophistication to what was underneath simple cruelty. "What an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware the foundation had expanded into popular entertainment." Dean picked up a glass of club soda. He'd been sober for 3 years, a personal victory that few people knew about. He took a slow sip and responded in that warm, unhurried voice that had made millions feel like his personal friend. "Evening, Maestro. Nice turnout for a good cause." That was all. His voice carried no defensiveness, no challenge, just the natural dignity of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. Jian stepped forward with the warmth that had smoothed 1,000 such moments. "Maestro Zimmerman, we heard your Beethoven cycle last season. Truly magnificent." Zimmerman accepted the compliment with practiced grace, but his eyes never left Dean. "Ah, Beethoven. Yes, music that demands decades of training to perform, let alone truly appreciate, layers of meaning, structural complexity, emotional depth that perhaps doesn't translate to." He paused for effect. 3-minute songs about falling in love. The circle of onlookers had grown larger. Dean set his glass on the bar and looked at Zimmerman directly, without flinching or backing down. "I reckon 3 minutes is plenty," Dean said, his voice carrying just enough of his Ohio roots to remind everyone present that he hadn't forgotten where he came from. "If you've got something real to say." Zimmerman's smile remained fixed, but something shifted behind his pale blue eyes. He wasn't accustomed to being answered back with that kind of quiet confidence, especially not by someone he considered beneath his artistic notice. "Come now, Mr. Martin. Surely you appreciate the difference between what we create here and what you perform in your venues. Classical music is the language of civilization itself. Popular music is perfectly adequate for what it is." He looked around, making sure everyone was listening. Simple melodies for simple emotions. The air in the reception hall grew heavy. Sheen took a half step forward, but Dean touched her arm gently, barely visibly. She knew that touch after 20 years of marriage. She could read it the way a sailor reads changing weather. It meant he had this under control. It meant something was stirring behind those dark, quietly confident eyes. But what nobody expected was what Zimmerman did next. The conductor turned to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the theatrical projection of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "In fact, I have a proposal. Tonight's program features the finest classical musicians in New York, but perhaps, in the spirit of cultural exchange, we might invite Mr. Martin to give us a performance." He turned back to Dean with exaggerated warmth. "One song just for the entertainment value. I'm certain my orchestra could provide adequate accompaniment, assuming you can manage to stay in the proper key." The laughter was thin and nervous. The trap was obvious to everyone present. Zimmerman expected Dean to either refuse and appear diminished, or accept and humiliate himself in a hall built for Puccini and Pavarotti. Either way, the conductor would have proven his point about the gulf between real musicians and mere entertainers. Jeanne leaned close to her husband's ear. "Dean, let's leave. We don't need this nonsense." Her whisper carried the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had spent 2 decades standing between this man and everything that tried to diminish him. The critics, the industry politics, the constant need to prove that underneath the casual exterior was a genuine artist. Dean didn't answer immediately. He looked at Zimmerman, then passed him through the auditorium doors, where rows of crimson velvet seats waited in the half-light, and a magnificent Steinway grand piano gleamed at center stage like a black mirror. He thought about every voice that had ever told him he wasn't a real singer, just a personality. He thought about the music teachers who had dismissed him, the critics who had called him lightweight, the classical musicians who had never bothered to listen closely enough to hear what he was actually doing. Then he looked at Jean, and she saw it. That expression she'd witnessed in recording studios, and on stages from the Copa to the Sands. The look that said Dean Martin had made up his mind, and nothing on earth was going to change it. "All right," Dean said. His voice didn't rise above its normal conversational tone. It didn't need to. "Where's the stage?" The smirk on Zimmerman's face held, but something behind it flickered. He had expected hesitation, negotiation, perhaps graceful withdrawal, not this granite certainty from a man his entire cultural world had dismissed as a crooner. She unclosed her eyes for a moment, squeezed her husband's hand, and then let go. She didn't try to stop him, because after 20 years, she knew something that Heinrich Zimmerman did not. She knew what Dean Martin could do with nothing but a microphone and a song that mattered to him. The event organizer appeared at Dean's side, pale and clearly panicking. This wasn't in the evening's carefully planned program, but Gian whispered something in the woman's ear, and after a long moment of internal struggle, she nodded. Dean straightened his black tie and turned toward the stage. The crowd parted before him, like water around a ship's bow. Nobody knew exactly what was about to happen, but in 4 minutes, 2,800 people were going to discover what Dean Martin sounded like when he had something to prove. Not to them, not to Heinrich Zimmermann, but to every young Italian-American kid who had ever been told that their dreams weren't sophisticated enough for the real world. Dean walked slowly toward the stage, and the conversations behind him faded to whispers. Jan stayed at the edge of the reception hall, hands clasped, watching her husband approach what could be either vindication or humiliation. Zimmermann had taken position in the front row, arms crossed, legs extended, the posture of a man settling in to watch a verdict he had already delivered. Several of his colleagues joined him, their expressions ranging from anticipation to barely concealed embarrassment for what was about to unfold. Dean climbed the steps to the stage, his movements unhurried despite the weight of 3,000 pairs of eyes. He crossed to where the accompanist sat at the grand piano, leaned down, and spoke quietly. Her eyes widened slightly, but after a moment she nodded and placed her hands on the keys. Dean walked to center stage and stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. He didn't approach the microphone stand immediately. Carnegie Hall was designed for unamplified performance, and Dean understood acoustics the way he understood most things about music, not through formal study, but through decades of standing in rooms and learning how they breathed. Then he spoke, and his voice filled the auditorium without effort, warm and conversational, as if he were talking to friends in his living room rather than addressing Manhattan's cultural elite. "I didn't go to conservatory," he began. "Most of you probably know that. I grew up in Steubenville, Ohio. My father worked in a barber shop, and my mother took in laundry to help make ends meet." He paused, his gaze drifting to a point somewhere above the back rows, seeing something beyond the present moment. "But we had music in our house. My mother sang Italian folk songs while she worked. My father hummed Neapolitan melodies he'd learned from his own father. When I was 8 years old, they saved enough money to buy an old upright piano, and my mother taught me the songs her grandmother had sung in the old country." Another pause. Longer this time. The auditorium had gone completely still, the kind of silence that only comes when people stop listening with their minds and start listening with something deeper. One of those songs was Ave Maria. Not the Schubert version you all know, but an older one, simpler, the kind that Italian mothers sang to help their children sleep. My mother sang it to me when I was sick, when I was scared, when the world seemed too big for a barber's son to ever understand. Dean's voice didn't break, but there was something in it that pressed against the walls of that magnificent room, something that made the formal distance between performer and audience irrelevant. Dean looked at the pianist and nodded. She played the opening notes of Ave Maria, but not the elaborate classical arrangement the audience expected. This was simpler, older, carrying the weight of centuries of mothers singing to their children. Dean closed his eyes and began to sing. That voice, warm as honey and deeper than regret, filled Carnegie Hall the way sunrise fills a valley, not by force but by simply being what it was. He didn't sing it the way a trained operatic baritone would have. There was no vibrato study, no careful breath control, no academic precision. But there was a boy, listening to his mother sing in a small house in Ohio. There was a young man who had worked his way from small clubs to the biggest stages in the world, never forgetting the melodies that had shaped him. There was an artist who had spent 30 years being told he wasn't sophisticated enough, finally given the chance to show what sophistication really meant. Every year of experience was in that voice. The immigrant family's dreams, the struggle to be taken seriously, the joy of success that never quite erased the memory of being dismissed. He sang in Italian for the first verse, his pronunciation perfect, because these weren't words he had learned from books, but melodies that lived in his DNA. When Dean reached the second verse, something extraordinary happened. Heinrich Zimmermann, the man who had set this entire confrontation in motion, slowly rose from his seat. Not to leave, not in protest, but because something in Dean's performance had reached through 45 years of musical education and touched the place where he had first fallen in love with music as a child in Vienna. One by one, others followed. Not applauding, not cheering, just standing because they felt something wholly moving through the room, something that made their formal evening clothes and social positions irrelevant. Dean sang the final verse, a cappella. The pianist's hands rested motionless on the keys, the orchestra sat silent, and his unaccompanied voice filled Carnegie Hall the way candlelight fills a cathedral, not by overpowering the darkness, but by making it welcome. The last note hung in the air for what seemed like minutes. Then it faded, and the silence that replaced it was not empty. It was the silence of 3,000 people who had just been reminded that music doesn't come from training or technique or cultural credentials. It comes from the part of a person that has been broken open enough to let the truth out. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Then the applause began. Not the polite classical music applause of gloved hands, but the raw, full-bodied sound of people clapping because their hearts were moving faster than their minds could catch up. 3,000 people on their feet, some wiping their eyes, some looking at strangers with the bewildered intimacy of people who have shared something they hadn't expected to feel. Jeanne stood at the edge of the hall, both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had heard Dean sing that song 1,000 times, in their living room, in recording studios, at family gatherings, but never in a room full of people who had tried to make him small, and watched him become the largest thing in it. Zimmermann rose from his seat and walked toward the stage. The auditorium fell quiet, watching this confrontation between worlds, between old traditions and authentic artistry. He climbed the steps and stood before Dean, conductor and crooner, theory and truth facing each other under the lights. Zimmermann extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, but Carnegie Hall's perfect acoustics carried every syllable to the back rows. "I was arrogant, and I was profoundly wrong." Dean took the man's hand with a smile that held no triumph, only understanding. "We all hear what we expect to hear sometimes. What matters is what you do when you realize you've been listening with the wrong ears." 3 weeks later, a review appeared in the New York Times art section. The critic wrote, "In a hall that has hosted Caruso and Callas, it was a 53-year-old man from Ohio singing an ancient Italian lullaby who reminded us why any of this matters in the first place." But the real story happened 6 months later when Heinrich Zimmermann, interviewed by Musical America magazine, was asked to name the greatest vocal performance he had witnessed in 4 decades of conducting. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Carnegie Hall, 1971. A man I had insulted stood on that stage, with no formal training, no operatic technique, no conservatory credentials, and sang a song his mother had taught him. And I understood that everything I knew about music was only half the truth." The interviewer pressed him. What was the other half? Zimmermann smiled, not his practiced conductor's smile, but something real and humble. "Heart," he said. "Authenticity. The courage to be vulnerable in front of 3,000 strangers. You can study that for 40 years and never learn it if you don't have it inside you." Years later, Jeanne spoke about that evening with a music journalist. "I was terrified when Dean walked up those steps, but then I remembered this was a man who had sung for kings and truck drivers, who had worked his way from small Ohio clubs to the biggest stages in the world, who had never forgotten where he came from or who had helped him get there." She paused, still emotional, decades later. Dean didn't have a music degree, but he had something more important. He had the truth of his own experience, and that night, the truth was enough. Dean Martin was not a classical singer, but that night he reminded 3,000 people of the oldest lesson in music, that a song sung from an authentic heart will always reach further than perfect technique ever could. Ave Maria was written in the 18th century as a prayer to the Mother of Christ. Dean sang it in 1971 as a prayer to his own mother and to every dreamer who had ever been told they weren't good enough. And he proved that grace doesn't ask for your credentials. It only asks whether you've lived enough to know what it means to be human. If this story of unexpected triumph and the power of authentic artistry moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know that real talent doesn't come from degrees or approval, but from the courage to be genuinely yourself. Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who had already decided you didn't belong? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when authenticity conquered prejudice.